there, the gap between what the prosecutor would charge. And I'm sure that there have been instances where you really do know.
Yeah.
But you can't prove that there's a problem.
Right.
That's what concerns me.
Or
is that-
instances where someone has left their employment prior to an investigation being completed. We still would always finish an investigation, but might not be able, if we don't have the cooperation of the employee because they've already left their employment, to see that all the way through. So when I represented other divisions as outside counsel, sometimes there'd be separation agreements with staff members that otherwise wouldn't have been leaving on the best terms. I think that by having GA in our quiver, we can turn around and on counsel for any employee and say, no, it's part of our policy and part of the Virginia Code that if we have probable cause, we cannot transmit this employee's personnel record. And here, we do think it rises to that level. But even there, I would be involved. So I don't think that having the language probable cause would limit our staff members to say, well, I'm not quite sure what that means, so I'm not going to do anything. I think coupled with training, if there's a concern or an inkling or a issue or a suspicion, that's going to be reported to our administrators, to Dr. Noonan, and I'll help with determining what do we do next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments on that policy? All right, is that
That was the
one?
last
Okay.
for the second reading policy.
All right, so if there are no further questions or comments, then I would ask for a motion to approve second reading and adoption of the policies just discussed.
I move that the school board approve second reading and adoption of policy ITAA, textbook selection, adoption and purchase, IIA, instruction materials, IIAB, supplementary materials selection and adoption, GCQA, non-school employment by staff members, GCBD, staff leave and absences, GCBA, leave without pay, and GA, personnel policy goals.
Thank you, Ms. Liddon. Second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Russell. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? To 7.08, the first reading of policies.
There are two policies for first reading tonight. The first is policy GBEC, GFCH, KGC. These are the policies that we had previously come before the board on tobacco products, nicotine vapor products, and e-cigarettes. And the board had adopted these policies last year in September. And now the Virginia Code has consolidated those, so the VSBA consolidated those policies and makes all tobacco products and nicotine vapor products all together. The one thing I did want to point out to the board about this policy, as in addition to removing 3 policies and consolidating them into one policy, it does put the superintendent at line 11 of GBEC. The superintendent is responsible for developing regulations that contain provisions for enforcement of the policy among students, employees, and visitors, including enumeration of possible sanctions or disciplinary actions and referrals to resources to help staff and students overcome tobacco addiction. So assuming the board approves this policy for first reading tonight and then does adopt it next month, I will work with Dr. Noonan to make sure that we have met with our principals and have put together regulations that can help the supervisors and administrators in enumerating the possible sanctions and coming up with lists of referrals that we can give to staff and to students. But otherwise, this policy is consistent with the previous policy of saying that students and staff members cannot use tobacco or nicotine vapor products on school grounds, and others can't on school grounds as well. Students and staff also cannot at off-site school-sponsored activities. So the language and the requirements of this are similar to what was enumerated in the 3 previous policies.
I did have to laugh when we looked at this update from VSBA after having that long drawn-out conversation about a year ago about how do we define a nicotine vapor product, and then they came out with a definition of what it was.
Yeah.
Where were you a year ago?
Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Russell?
I just had, I guess, a comment slash request. Assuming we approve the policy and at the point that the regulations are developed, is that something that I guess Dr. Noonan and yourself could come back to the board with just to present what the regulations are? Because I think it's a pretty hot topic in our community. And so I think that that's something that we would definitely want to just understand what's being put in place in terms of the regulations.
I'd certainly be happy to share the regulation with you after it's done.
Any other questions? Mr. Castillo?
Well, in the theme of trying to keep up with developments in the marketplace, there are vapors that are not nicotine as well. How are we going to catch up with that one?
Yeah. It does say at line 24, while it does say container of nicotine in solution or other form that is intended to be used with or without an electronic cigarette, electronic cigar, electronic cigarillo, electronic pipe, or similar product or device, and anything that's regulated by the FDA. But I, between now and second reading, I'd be happy to look into whether there's vapor products that don't have nicotine that aren't regulated by the FDA. And then we can see if we need to add some more language on that.
Yeah, I mean, the CBD pods being the obvious
Okay.
issue.
CBD pods, okay. I'm going to do
We'll
some
take that
learning.
back. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this could be an ongoing policy that we just bring back as new products come out. Thank you for raising that. Anything else on GBEC?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have kind of a dumb question just in formatting. Lines 141 to 148 are, they're the ones that aren't struck out and they are highlighted, and I wasn't sure how to interpret all of that, so.
Oh, let's see. That's a good point. These are notes for me that this has been removed from the model policy, but it's still something that I think that we should do. So I shouldn't have left it here, but I want to make sure that we still have these requirements, that we still include this information in the student employee handbooks, that we still have the no smoking signs posted. Oh, and actually, the one at 143 to 146 was removing the requirement. I did speak to Ms. Ewing about this. The Virginia Code had previously required a no smoking sign in all cafeterias, and that was back when there could be portions of the school that were smoking. So now that all schools are smoke-free, there's no longer a requirement for no smoking signs in the cafeteria, but there is still an expectation, and I think it still makes sense to have no smoking signs around the school building, the perimeter, saying that it's a no smoking area. But that was my note to myself that still's left in there.
So ignore the highlighted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else on GBEC? I am kind of sad that we did such good work on those three policies and to bring a policy that doesn't delete the number of policies that we still have to go. But sometimes it's two steps forward and one step back, and that's okay. Okay, the final policy for this evening is GAD, access to employee social media accounts. The policy this would replace is policy 8.23.1. The language is virtually exactly the same from our current policy to this model policy. The short version of this is the school board does not require current or prospective employees to disclose their username or passwords to social media accounts. They're not required to add an administrator as a friend or to their list of contacts. If a school board or a school board employee inadvertently receives an employee's username or password or other login information, they are to not use that information, though the board will not be liable for having the information if it happens to be on the computers. But there's also at lines 14 to 15, the policy does not prohibit, Yeah, 14 and 15 says the school board is not prohibited from viewing information about current or prospective employees that are otherwise publicly available. And finally, the policy does not prohibit the school board from requesting access to an employee's username and password for the purpose of conducting a formal investigation or a related procedure into an allegation that the employee has violated federal, state, or local laws or regulations or the board's written policies. I do think that it's important that we keep that, and it's something that I know most local boards do have, and it is word for word consistent with our current policy 8.32.1. Questions on policy GAD?
Yeah, Mr. Castillo?
Madam Chair, well, the line 16 part says we can request it. Doesn't say they have to provide it, and what happens if they don't.
That's true.
And maybe we want to be clearer about that, or not. Which sort of dovetails with the second issue, and that is, and maybe we have it in another policy, and I'm just so confused by throwing out all the letters, all the numbers and
you're-
putting in letters.
if you're confused,
Do
then
we
I am
have a
too.
policy that says what you can and can't and should and shouldn't do with social media? Or is that being handled at the superintendent? I mean, I know there are policies about that.
We don't have a
But-
social media policy, and that was something you had actually raised
Right.
about a year and a half ago, and I've been able to pull some from the Council of School Attorneys as things have come up, and that's one that I'm hoping that we look into and add. It's not a policy that the VSBA has put something together on, so it's going to require some kind of pulling from other divisions to determine if that's what we want to do. But I am hoping that sometime this school year during a work session, we can bring that to see if that's something the board would like me to spend time on. As far as your initial question of, do we want to say that an employee has the right to refuse? I think it's better left unsaid. And if an employee doesn't want to share that information, then we assess that or address that at the time. But I do think it's important to say that there is a policy that the school board isn't prohibited from asking. So it's not an invasion of someone's First Amendment rights if we say, will you please provide this to us?
Maybe if we have probable cause, we can do it.
Criminal probable cause? Does there have to be a criminal issue at stake? Yeah.
I will note to your question about the social media policy, having worked in another school division about 7 years ago where we were trying to develop a social media policy as social media was developing, and it continues to develop, and sort of almost like the vaping, it expands as much as it doesn't, as anything else. It's really difficult to figure out what the right policy is with respect to how social media can be used by teachers especially, because there is a lot of instructional information that's shared over social media. There is Instagramming that happens, there is Twitter that's happening, and the like. So I'm open to having the conversation to look at it, but I'm more inclined to fall back on some of our ethical and professional expectations that we have of staff, in conjunction with how we look at and view social media. But that may be a topic for another day.
Yeah, and I would say on that, I mean, I know of instances where teachers had private Facebook groups that were very productive and had great exchanges of ideas. But at the same time, that's potentially problematic. And I think there are plenty of stories in the news where social media leads in directions that are gateways to serious problematic behavior, and couple that with an inability to investigate that in a way that if we want to see what those posts are, we can get to them. I think we're asking for trouble. And we'll get it eventually.
As far as training of staff, my annual training does tell staff that the expectation is that they are not to friend students. They are not to have relationships online with students that parents don't have access to and aren't aware of. So all communications with students should be on our Schoology, on their school email, on their school Twitter if they're using it, but not private messages with students. So that's not included in our handbook. I'm actually looking at that now because I thought we had included something.
And that is, by the way, where we landed with our policy previously, was that everything had to be open. And there couldn't be private Facebook groups. There couldn't